Hey, how's it going? This is Professor Krspo, and this is Music Production 101. What's up, guys? Welcome to week 3. We're going to be doing mixing today. So we're going to get into all kinds of stuff, levels, gain staging, more about compression, more about EQ, more about saturation, more about all that fun stuff. So let's get right to it. So a lot of people have come up to me and said mixing is so hard. They have all these issues when it comes to mixing. I think mixing is actually really simple once you understand certain fundamentals. So the first thing we're going to get into are those fundamentals. All right, so fundamentals of mixing. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about are the faders. So all this is a volume control, just like in your car and whatnot. So this is kind of a weird window to work from, but if I solo this, these are the drums. As I bring the fader up and down, the volume goes up. So this is the most basic and fundamental thing you need to know with mixing. Is sometimes, I see so many people that something's loud or too quiet, and instead of just turning it down with the fader, they start EQing everything, or they compress the hell out of it. The fader is your friend. Use this thing. It's great. And you don't need to use it much. If you look at this mix, it's a pretty decent mix from the start. And all I'm doing, drums are pretty much unity. Down, then I have this little analog thing lower. This is the weird sound. So I have this a little bit lower, but still pretty high in the mix. This bass is at unity. You know, this sub is a little bit lower. But you see, I'm utilizing the fader to kind of balance the mix out first before I even start adding EQ. I'm using the fader. So it's important to do that. And one thing that's always asked is okay, where should certain things be? Okay, so let's look at that. So first of all, the drums. You see the drums here. My drums are actually probably a little too hot. So because you probably want your drums a little bit lower than negative 0.3. You probably want them give yourself some headroom a little bit. But there's different ways to mix. So this could be one way to mix. Turn your drums down to about negative 9.6. That way, when everything is going together, it's not going to be blaring. We could do that. But your drums should be a pretty strong thing in your mix. And another way to mix is a way that I like to do sometimes, just because I'm lazy and I don't always like to turn everything down and gain stage stuff, is I will use the oscilloscope. And so you want to kind of make sure your drums are pretty peaky. They're especially in dance music, drums are usually one of the main things. So you want your drums to be a big part of the mix. If you notice here, you notice when the snare happens here, it's way more energy than these. So there's ways we can fix that. We'll get into that later. But for right now, just knowing that the drums should look like something like this, where they're not blasting over they're not crunched down and blasting super high, but they are a main part of the mix. And then when you start adding the other elements, you'll see the drums are kind of the fundamental thing that holds the rest of this stuff together. So that's just one thing to kind of think about, is using the faders and then setting yourself up so your drums are your driving factor, and then you can kind of bring other things in. And then once you have your mix built, you can always turn things down. So maybe the drums, you start off them being your kind of driver, and then later on you're okay, wait, the song is calling for a little bit more of the melody and less of the percussion. So you can just, turn that down with the fader. You don't need to EQ things. You don't need to change things too much. So that's the fader. Let me go over real quick. So the drums should be pretty loud. Your main elements, so you're the main element in this song is this bass. So that should be pretty loud too. If you look at this in the oscilloscope, it's, not super loud, but it's, loud enough to come through. I could probably actually boost this even more and it would be totally fine. So I'm just turning the volume up. That's it. And see, now it's the signal's a little bigger. So your bass, your sub bass, I like to kind of have my sub bass generally a little bit quieter than the drums because you don't want your sub bass to be like overwhelming and then drown your whole mix out. So you can kind of see if I take away the so that is a little quieter than if you see where the drums are when I bring the drums in. The drums are about here, except for the loud snare, but for the most part they're out there, and then you'll see the bass. So it's just a couple dB quieter, because what ends up happening is the kick and the bass a lot of times will it's a similar energy, so they kind of will amplify each other and it'll make the kick will make the bass sound louder and vice versa. So it's always good to have your bass a little bit lower than the kick. That way, when that happens, it's not like a huge deal. It'll just sound like they're kind of gelling together. You can also sidechain it too. That's another thing we're going to get into later. But right now, I'm just talking about the fader position. And then for vocals, notice the fader here is pretty low. That's because the signal's super hot. Because remember, we made this crazy vocal chain. So the signal is pretty hot coming off the vocals. If you look at the oscilloscope. Let me go back to this view just so I can do this easier. Because it's not even on the same vocal thing. Okay, so hold on. Copy this, just command copy, and I'm going to go command paste. So you see where the vocal is versus where like the drums are. In terms of loudness and where they sit in the mix, the vocals are going to be a little bit lower. One thing somebody like told me back in the day, they were like, it's good to have the vocal almost a little quiet sometimes in the mix because then it kind of makes people want to turn the song up. Versus if the vocal's really loud in the mix, the first inclination they'll have is to turn the song down. So if you're trying to figure out, should I make my vocal's sitting nice, but is it a little loud? It probably is. Just turn it down like a hair, or maybe EQ some of it a little bit, but reach for the fader first. That's what we're talking about first. Don't worry about the EQ yet. Just turn it down a little bit, just a tiny bit, and it should sit fine. So that's the fader. And next we're going to get into the panning. Okay, so panning. So the pan knob in Ableton is this knob right here. And all panning is where in the stereo spread, like where between like the speakers your whatever your panning is. So first of all, let's go to these. These are the drums. We could pan them all the way to the right, all the way to the left. Very weird. Drums are generally, you want your drums center. Hi-hats is when you can start kind of messing around a little bit. You can change, I kind of want to rename all these. You can change, like, you can have the hi-hats kind of being like more, like maybe one of them, you have two hi-hats, one of them comes from the left, one of them comes from the right. That's, something that you can do that's something I've done and had some good success with. So we can, for instance, we have this hi-hat. I think it sounds kind of cool when it comes from like the left a little bit. And there's like different perspectives. This is considered drummer's perspective because most drummers, their hi-hats on the left-hand side. So when you're listening to the song, it sounds like the hi-hats on the left. So it sounds like you're like behind the drummer almost. And then you can do the other side. So bring it to the right. And this is what they call audience perspective. Because if you're in the audience, the drummer's hi-hat will be on the left, but you're going to be facing him on the opposite side, so it'll be mirrored. So you would hear it on the right side. So that's another thing to kind of consider, like what perspective you want to do with your mix. Do you want to have it be like the person that's listening is in the band, or do you want to have it like the person that's listening is watching? So, and that can drastically change what you do in a mix, is depending on like what you're thinking of. Me, I'm a musician. So naturally, I always like want to be, when I play my music, I want to like feel like I'm like in the band basically. So I always do drummer perspective. But you know, it's up to you. It's up to whatever you want to do. That's the fun thing about mixing is you can do so much, and you can really like, you can really shape a song big time with the way you mix. So like, for instance, if I'm doing like a drum mix, there's so many different ways I can approach it. I can approach it in a way where I'm like, oh, I want the drums to be really dry. And like when I hit the snare, I don't want to hear like a ton of stuff. And I want the cymbals to be very controlled. Or, which is great for like a jazz record maybe, or like a pop record. Or maybe like you're doing some like punk metal, like rock, kind of heavier rock. And you want the cymbals, the drums to kind of have like more of a cymbal perspective and just sound huge. And you don't necessarily care if like the snare sounds dry. You might want the snare to even sound like it's in like a giant like coliseum when it's being hit. So there's so many different ways you can mix. And that's when you really start to like get creative. I feel like with songs is when you start getting in the mix and the details like that. So yeah, so that's the panning knob on the hi-hat. And then there's like different things you can do, like how I was auto panning this. So if you listen to the panning on this, even though it's centered, it goes basically all around. It does this. It like loops. So you'll see it's like the right side, left side. It kind of like, it does this little like squiggle thing around. So that's another thing you can do is have stuff kind of bouncing around in the stereo field. And that it's, you know, I like to call that like ear candy. And sometimes it's really cool. You can have like a really minimal track and then have little ear candy pieces here and there, and it'll like keep the listener's attention. So if that's the kind of thing you're into, if you're into making like more minimal music, you don't want to have like tons of layers and tons of huge sounds. You just want to have like a few things going on. Little ear candy things will keep people engaged. If your track starts to feel like, okay, it's getting a little stale here. What can I do? Maybe throw some ear candy in. Throw some like weird panning. Panning is great too because, you know, you have things in the center that are always in the center. Like I said, like the kick and the kick and the snare. If this wasn't in the center, it would sound so strange, you know, but there's things that you can get away with putting outside the center, and it might sound a little bit weird, but it might sound cool too. Like these things. And because this thing is like squiggling around, it doesn't like get in the way of the drum at all. So it's another thing to think about with mixing is like you're working with like a finite amount of space. So like think about, I always say the analogy, like it's like a bag. So you have a bag and like you're trying to put all this stuff in the center of the bag, like all these drums and all this bass and like all these this analog bass, and then the vocals are in the center. Like all these things are in the center. And it's like you can overfill the center like really easily. But if you can pan stuff and you can figure out ways to like put things in different pockets here, like a little bit off to the left. It doesn't have to be crazy, like a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. You'll find that your mixes will sound much wider, and then you'll also be able to make them much louder too, because everything isn't fighting for the center and the space in the center. So, and then, you know, you always have to look for like mono compatibility. So make sure it sounds good in mono still, even though it's, you know, off to the side or and whatnot. But for the most part, like panning and stuff that's the way to get really good sounding mixes, is being like panning stuff to the right, to the left, a little bit, you know, just a little bit or a lot, you know, but experiment with it. Yeah, so I think I've pretty much gone over panning enough. You know, it's the middle's a safe spot, but feel like challenge yourself to try to pan stuff to different sides, because it can be really cool and really rewarding when you do that. And like I said, it'll make your mix sound way bigger. Wider like sounds louder to people. So if somebody hears something that's really wide, it'll naturally sound louder, even though your mix isn't necessarily louder than somebody else's. If you can pan stuff well and make it wide, it'll sound louder than other people's. So yeah, that's panning. Next up, we're going to hit equalization again, because I guess it's important. I don't know. I feel like that's the next step. We got this cool track. I mean, we could do more cool stuff with delay, but I think let's start with equalization and go from there. So start with this bass here, because this is kind of the thing that's starting to bug me a little bit. So this is a really cool bass. Remember how I said it's like full frequency? Like it's got a lot going on. So we can actually probably trim a little bit of this down. So first of all, let's take out some of this mud. So that's a kind of a deep cut. So I'm gonna do about 4.5, right around this range. And I'm doing this because this seems, and you can kind of see it on the spectrograph here. You can see where the hottest point is, but I don't like to always do that. Try to hear it. Try to hear like, okay, it sounds like around 100, or this is like sub bass, so I know it's down here. Or like, just try to get in the habit of that. You can solo this too. So if you really want to. If you want to know exactly like what it is, you just hit this little solo button up here, and then you can click on the guy when it's playing. So super helpful. If you, and like I used to do that a lot when I was like kind of learning what all the frequencies were, but now I'm better at it now, so I just kind of do it by ear. But this is a great thing to do when you're starting off. Just try to indicate what's the problem first, being like, okay, there's a sub bass, and now we have this other bass, and they're both in this region. You know, try to do that first, and then go back and like check your work with the solo and be like, oh yeah, we don't need any of this. We don't need any of that. And now it has kind of like it now, because we turned it up in the mix, now the highs kind of seem accentuated because the low end, now we brought the low end down. So it's like the highs are still there. And it now, so that's what you can do with EQ. It's like tone shaping. Like we shape the tone now a little bit. Now it's got kind of a higher tone than a lower tone. So that's the main thing, I think the way to look at EQ. And then like what I was saying before, the basics, like low passing stuff that you don't need low on, high passing stuff you don't need highs on. So we could probably high pass this bass. Oh no, we already did. Okay. I was just about to do that. So we don't need to high pass this bass, but you know what I'm saying? Like we don't need all this extra information out here, so we can, you know, cut some of that. I don't want to do too much because I actually kind of like the way it sounds right now, but you get the point, you know, and experiment with that. You can also do that sometimes on drums. Throw like a little, throw a little EQ on the drums and just kind of experiment with. So, I mean, I don't know if I would do that. I'd probably do that and then kick it back a little bit. But you know what I'm saying? You're taking little cuts, and the more room you make, and you know, with these little tiny cuts, the better your sound is going to be 9 out of 10 times. Just don't do anything drastic. When you start hearing it really affecting the sound, that's a good time to like back off. Unless you're, you know, doing tone things like what I did here, when you're really trying to like change the tone. I'm not trying to change the tone of these drums, but I'm just trying to shave off any extra fat that I can. Just clean it up a little bit. You know, put it in a box basically, or a bag. Fit it in there better. So what else can we go over with EQ? So, okay, so there's different EQ shapes. So let's hit that. So what I used earlier on this thing, this is a bell. So it looks like a bell, kind of. That's why they call it a bell. And you can change the Q of the bell down here if you want. The default Q is pretty good for this octave, or this frequency range, I mean. But yeah, you can change the bell there. That's a bell curve. And then you have a shelf, which is this one here. And it looks like this. See, it's kind of like a shelf. So that's good. These are good like toning things to use. The bell, super useful. Like if you like have like a specific frequency you want to turn down, use the bell. If you have a frequency you want to turn up, I would suggest instead of turning it up, trying to shape it a little bit. You know, go to the fader first, and if the fader, you know, doesn't get you the results you want, or if you'll probably notice the low end being a little loud, then you just do this. But another way to do that is you kind of just do this prematurely. You're like, okay, yeah, I want this to be more high-endy. Let me turn the lows down. So that's, and then, yeah, same with the high shelf. You want more like high-end, just boost the shelf. Again, this is after the level. So you got your levels good, and then you're like, oh, I want a little bit more high-end. Okay, let me boost the shelf. Boom. Use EQ to shape and tone the frequencies. Don't just use it like to make giant cuts and like make these huge boosts. Subtle things like this really like go a long way in actually changing the sound. You don't have to be like crazy making like these crazy like tons of cuts, And if your EQ does look, I don't want to do that. If your EQ does look like this, like crazy like this, if it looks crazy like this, you're probably just better off just turning the sound down and then kind of going and then restarting the EQ and going from there. Because you should never have to do this. Like, this is nuts. This doesn't make any sense either. It's like, what do you want? You just want the low end of this, well, I guess we cut the low end, so you don't even want the low end. You already have the low end cut. What do you just want this 2000 range? Like, no, this is dumb. This sounds bad. This sounds like you messed the sound up. You don't want to do that. So just little things, maybe this, I don't know, probably not, because you're already high passing it. So that didn't even make any sense anyway, So just focusing on like little things goes a long way. I don't want to like keep stating that, but yeah, there's different cuts. I went over that. So yeah, I think that's the EQ. We're going to move on. All right. So I'm going to just reiterate one more time. So taking out this mid-range, it's like mud, and that's why I call it the boomy mud range. This will help you get a crisp sounding mix, a crispity crackling mix. If you do that, so do that. I get asked that so much. Like, how do you get crisp sounding mixes? It's like, just cut the mud out of stuff that doesn't need mud. Obviously you don't want to cut too much of your, like the low end, with your bass. You don't want to cut too much of the, that out of your bass, but maybe you do. Let's see. I think we do want to do that, actually. So you see what I mean? Like, you can just go through every instrument and you could probably get away with a little bit of a cut there. Again, I'm not saying go crazy. I'm not saying like go out of your way to hunt for this kind of stuff, but this is 4 dB less of BS that you just saved 4 dB in your mix for something else. And what sits really predominantly in this range too is your drums. So that's another thing to think about when you're making these cuts. Don't just think about the sound. Like, don't just think about, I'm cutting the sub bass. Like, think about the sub. Listen to the drums when I make this cut. Don't worry about the bass. I know I'm making a cut on the bass, but listen to the drums when I make this cut. You hear that? They kind of come through a little bit better. It's not huge, but that's not the point. It's not about having a huge change with one knob. It's about making a bunch of little changes like this all through your mix. And I mean, not even all through your mix. I don't want to keep saying like all through your mix, like this is a huge mix. This is so small, but I'm saying if you do have a mix that's huge, I could open up another file where there's like 70 tracks, not 10. And you'll be like, holy, like, this is a gigantic mix. What do you do? Just do this. Go through every track and see, turn this down. Does it hurt the sound? Okay, it hurts the sound. All right, don't do that. Get away from that. But if you notice your mix is like not crispy, it's like, kind of muddy, kind of like not that clean, you go through your EQ and just do that. Okay. All right. So I'm moving on to the next thing now. Because I'm getting tired of hearing this like robot thing with nothing else on it. So we talked about doing delay throws and stuff before, but I'm going to do that like one more time because delay is a big part of mixing and it's a big part of creating an atmosphere and creating depth. It's difficult to create depth if everything you have is just a dry sound or a dry signal. So some like doing throws and using your sends to use your return tracks here will like help you out a lot. So I'm going to do that real quick. I'm going to do just a little automation. So let me turn this part down. It started a little sooner than I wanted. So this is another cool thing you can do. You select the automation you want to affect, and then you can just start kind of turning it down. And then I'm going to reselect here and go through like that. And then just clean it up a little bit. Kill all these dots. But yeah, so you get the point. You see that? Now we have like some weird depth in that cool spot that there wasn't before. Now there's depth here. And before that was just a dry, dull signal. So now we used a little bit of delay. It didn't take much, just a little tiny bit on the end here. We kind of added a little bit and then a lot right at the end. And then that's how you get this cool kind of like... Now you have your dry stuff in the mix, like your drums and your hi-hats and your bass. They kind of now can sit in this cool pocket where there's like a delay going on, and there's now there's like a cool space around your sounds. So that's a little trick just to get some space around your sounds. Exactly that. And we're already doing it. If you look, we're already doing it on this, and we're already doing it again on this. So I don't want to go over it like too much because we already did. But delay is super important for getting your sound sounding like, cool and depthy. And, it's not like a good rule of thumb for like, should I use a delay on this, is what happens when the sound stops. So like, for instance, if I turn this off, if I just delete this. See how it just kind of cuts out? That's a good indicator to be like, oh, maybe I can like throw something on that so the sound doesn't just stop right there. It kind of like fades out in a way, but in a cool way, in a unique way that adds like now atmosphere and depth to your song, because now you have some cool funky delay going on. So stuff like that, man, it makes a big difference. Again, it's not a huge thing. It's not like anything crazy. I'm not saying put it on your, all your drums or all your, basses. Maybe don't put it on the bass, or maybe do, or on the high end. You don't want to mess with the sub, but we'll definitely do some delay stuff with the drums too. I mean, you can do all kinds of fun stuff. There's actually really good presets too. Like we can go dub, just type dub in, and all of a sudden we got like a dub delay. Wait, is that not it? Oh, here it is. Fake dub room. Yeah. We got a dub delay on our snare. And you don't have to have it all the time because you have dry wet here. And we can do automation. I don't really like this one. Let's try this one. Ooh, there we go. But anyway, you get the point. Delay is really cool. You can do it on drums. I like to do it on snares mostly, or like rims. Maybe percussion a little bit. I kind of try to stay away from it on the kick. But, feel free to experiment. And if you do something cool, send it to me because I want to hear it. So that's delay. So next up, let's stick with the return tracks and why I like to use them. Let's go to reverb. So yeah, the reason I like to do the return tracks is because of stuff like this, because you can just send like a bunch of different things to the same delay or the same, reverb as I'm going to show you. And it kind of makes your mix sound more cohesive, and it makes it sound like it's being played in like a room, almost like it's like a band. I come from bands. I was a drummer, and I always like did like band recording before. So I always kind of think about mixes like like that. Like you're kind of in a room. You're hearing the sound in like a room, in the context of a room. Because, you know, if you see somebody live, that's what it's going to be in. So you kind of want to try to do something like that with the mix. So one way to do that is using reverb. So what are some good things to use reverb on? Hi-hats are good. You don't want to go overboard, right? Remember I was saying it's all about like a little bit. So you could probably send like -22. It's just a little bit, but it adds like some space. Now your hi-hats are in like a little bit of a space. So before, you know, they're cool, but it's like, you know, it's just now it's a little bit cooler. And you know what else too? Because we added a little reverb. Now we're adding a little bit of volume to the hi-hats. We can probably turn them down a little bit. Right? That sounds good. Not around -3. So you see what I just did there? I added a little bit of reverb to the hi-hats, and then it allowed me now to bring the hi-hats down because now they're like, they have space. They're like, not only is it a sound, but there's also now like it's in a space, so it's a little bit louder. It's more in the mix, and it's adding depth now to my mix. I can bring it down. I can make now more space for other things that I want. So now the kick and the snare sound louder because now the hi-hat's a little quieter. It's all perspective. You turn one thing down, it's going to make other things sound louder, and that can get confusing sometimes. So don't overthink it. Just go with your head. Be like, okay, this part sounds a little loud. Let me turn it down. But also know that when you turn that down, listen in your mix for what comes up. You know what I'm saying? So there's a balance, because sometimes you'll turn stuff down, way down, and then it'll bring other things up, and then you're like, oh, and then you're just turning that down, and then you end up in this like constant turning everything down, where everything now, all your faders are at like 0 or at -60. You know what I'm saying? So be cognizant of that. So know that when I turn one thing down, it's going to make other things sound louder. Just know that, you know, think about it like, again, like it's a bag, it's a box. You know, if you have something that takes up a lot of space in the box and then you make it smaller, now the other things that were in the box fighting for that space now have that space. They can now occupy that space. You know, everything in the box is fighting for space. So it's your job as a mixer to put everything in their own little space so everyone's happy and everything sounds good and clean. And it's not that hard. It's just about turning stuff down, turning certain things down while not turning everything down. Let me say that. But it's also about making little cuts and then making little moves like this, adding some atmosphere. What else can we add this reverb to? Let me get off. I'm going off on a tangent again. Maybe this thing? I don't know. Let's listen to it in the context of the mix. I kind of like that. It's a little bit, but now it's super loud because I'm adding all this reverb. So what are we going to do again? Turn it down. So notice how when I turn that down, everything, like that was taking up some space. I mean, it's a weird kind of sound. It doesn't look like it's doing a lot, but it's just like everything else. It's fighting for space. So when I turn this down, added some reverb, I kind of put it in the background, made it kind of like a more of an atmosphere effect than a foreground thing. And then it brought all this other stuff to the foreground. So for instance, this bass here, we can probably add some, it sounds like there is some verb on this though. Yeah, there is. I was hearing it before when we played it. So that might be weird if I add more reverb to it, but let me see. It's not terrible. All right, let's do it in the context of the mix, though. I don't like doing stuff solo. Let's play in the mix. Cool. Yeah, so -23. Again, not a lot. A little goes a long way. So yeah, that is the reverb What else? I wouldn't add it to the sub bass. Doesn't make any sense. The vocals, we already have it on these. We don't have it on these, but it was printed with that much reverb on it. So that one does have it. And that means these have it on there. So everything here has the reverb on it. And they all have the same reverb on it. So that kind of makes it cohesive a little bit. So we could add the reverb too to the snare. And the only problem is we can't use the send to do it. Because if we do that, we got the kick kind of, I don't know if you guys hear that. The kick is being reverberated too. Here, I'll mute this. So that could be a cool intro, but it's not really working for what we're trying to do. So I'm just going to copy this reverb, Command C, and then paste it into this snare's track. So I click on the snare in the drum rack, and then you can add effects to the track. And you're going to want to turn the dry wet way down. So now the snare sounds like it's in a room. And again, we could probably turn this down a little bit now. So boom, just like that. We just added reverb to like 4 or 5 different things. And if you notice, the mix is starting to sound a little bit more cohesive. I do think I went a little overboard, so I'm going to turn it down maybe. I'm turning all the reverb now down a little bit. So that feels a little better. Maybe we'll turn it back up a little bit. Yeah, but anyway, so yeah, that's the reverb. All right, cool. So let's go over a little bit more of like the overdrive real quick. So if you hear this bass, my nice bass here. Is this the right bass? Am I looking at the right bass? This is the bass. So I just want to go over, like, I know we went over saturation a little bit, but I'm going over this again, this overdrive. It's this is the distortion in Ableton. And notice I'm just using like a little bit. 33%, 20% dry wet. I'm cutting a little bit of the lows on the EQ. Not really messing with the tone. But this is the kind of stuff that, like, it just kind of adds a little bit of extra. You see what I mean? It's a tone thing. But it helps in the context of the mix. It helps a lot. Like I say, I do this stuff in the mix. I just show you guys in solo mode. But I'm always kind of, like, when I'm tweaking it, I always tweak it in the mix. See what I mean? I'm trying to make this thing more of like a higher end kind of like synth than like a low bass. Like it originally started as a basic analog bass. We cut the bass part out. So it's just an analog, a basic analog. And then we took the analog, we cut a little bit of the mud out, and now we're overdriving it. So it's like an overdrived analog, basically, with mud cut out of it. This is the best way to describe it, I think. So yeah, that's that. That's the overdrive. And again, there's a way to do it without ruining your mix. And it's like this, just barely doing it. I mean, there's a way to, if you want to go heavy distortion, you can do that too. But for this mix specifically, and for like a lot of stuff that I do and a lot of like EDM, you're going to notice you're going to be throwing like little overdrive and little saturation and just barely doing it, but just doing it enough that it really helps beef up your sound and make your sounds a lot like thicker and more impactful. And again, we're going to get into this stuff again later on in when we talk about sound design. So I'm not getting into it too much. I just want to show you guys how you can use it in the mix. I liked it. I was like, oh, I kind of like this overdrive here. It shapes this tone well. It makes the sub bass more subby and this thing more like synthy kind of. But yeah, so that's that. And then we already did this with the saturation. We talked about this, but again, like 5.7 dB. It's not a lot. And then you throw it through an amp, which amplifies the saturation that you already added. Cut the mud out, and then we added this nice hiss to it, which is actually probably a little bit loud, but you get the point though. It's like just I mean, it's just a little bit. Full dry wet, but we're only adding a little bit. We could go overboard and like crank it, but you don't have to. Like, try to work in increments of like 2 to 5 dB. If you catch yourself starting to go over that, then it's like, okay, what am I doing? Think about it like that. You can always use the fader. If you catch yourself going way overboard, then use the fader. But, so that's saturation. And then, okay, so I wanted to go over grouping tracks and like creating kind of like a bus chain. I already did it on this mix, on the take before, but I'm just going to show you guys again. So the way I do this usually is with G-Clip. And this is a free plugin. Super easy to use. I'll show you right now the way I use it. I know some people like to use it by pushing the gain. I like to push the gain in the mastering stage towards the end. So I just clip. I'm all about just like cutting, and then at the end, like bring it all up. So that's my method. There's other methods. There's other way to do it. You can push the gain and just keep pushing. But this is the way I like to do it. So I'll show you how to do it real quick. So this is the drums with no G-clip. So you notice how like some of them go kind of over the line. Some of them are a little bigger. Let's activate the G-clip, and you can actually start to like tame these transients a little bit. See that? I can really crank it. And see, it still sounds pretty good. It's not terrible, right? You can get away with like quite a bit. So yeah, that's that. That's the G-Clip. But you can also do that with the limiter in Ableton. You don't need to download G-Clip. It is free, but I do recommend getting it because it's super easy to use. But you can just turn the ceiling down on Ableton's limiter and get the same result. So just turn the ceiling down. This is what it is. And then you just start turning the ceiling down until you start to see like what you want to see in the oscilloscope, which is like something like that. So that's that. Now we got our drums. So here's the thing about mixing, like I was explaining before, but you're going to notice I'm going to keep reiterating the same things because they're important. They're fundamentals. They're super important. So you're going to notice now that I'm going to add the drum and the bass. And because the drums and the bass kind of sit in similar frequencies, you're going to see there's going to be, the waveform is going to be amplified. You'll see. If I just do the bass, that's it. That's my bass. But watch what happens when I add the drums. Watch, and if I just do the drums, everything's good, right? But watch when I add both the drums and the bass together. It's crazy, right? It's going over the thing again. So this is the kind of stuff that you gotta want to trim out the best you can. So the way to do it, again, you do use the limiter and you just adjust the ceiling. And use your ears too. Don't just like, crank it. Because I mean, you can make it really kind of gnarly. You want to keep some transients. You don't want to destroy all your transients. I'm not saying go and kill all your transients. I'm saying you don't need crazy transients in a mix because there's perceived transient. Like your brain will perceive it. If there's room for it in the mix, your brain will perceive that there's a, big transient there. You don't need like a giant one. So you can get away with kind of cutting, and I'm not cutting a lot. Again, I'm going in stages. So I started with the drums. That's kind of a lot, but maybe it's not. I don't know. -3. And then I moved to the bass, -2. And then now we're going to do the same thing. So you can select everything. And all I'm doing is just grouping. So the way to do this, and you're probably like, how do you get to this point? So I just selected these. These were already a group, right? Then I add the bass. I make that a group. And then I colored it black. Okay? And then I selected all of these. and then all of these at the same time, and made that a group and called it music, and then made that white. So this is how you get to this, like, where it's like groups on groups on groups on groups. That's how you do that. So again, now we're adding like robot voices, and we're going to add some other stuff to this real quick. Actually, I don't think that made that much of a difference. Whatever. Boom, boom. So this is the whole mix. Going through the oscilloscope. So it looks pretty good. So you notice like the things that really amplify and add a lot of volume are going to be like more the low end stuff. That's what's really going to cause you to clip easily. The higher end stuff you can get away with, and you see it right here. Like I'm just adding high end. Like none of this stuff has any low frequency information. So that's the only thing I've noticed so far, and that was from this robot voice thing. So that means the robot voice probably definitely has some low end on it. Yep. So it's not a lot, but it's enough to cut. So let's just cut at 100. Doesn't affect it at all. Sounds the same. So perfect. And then it should be fixed in here. Okay, so it went over a little bit still, but that's not that big of a deal. We can just cut that with the limiter. And now we're good to go. Look at that. Everything's in our little box. Everything's fitting nicely. And because of that, in the end stage of our mix, we can turn it up like 2 dB and make it nice and fat. We could probably even turn it up more, but we're just going to do that for now. I'm not trying to make super loud stuff right now. I just want to show you guys the basics. But obviously you can push this stuff. You know, we can push it a little harder if we want into the limiter, make it actually use the limiter. So now the limiter is being used. You don't want to go too overboard though. The whole point of this is so that your limiter doesn't have to work really hard. So yeah, that's that. That's how you like utilize buses. That's how you utilize clipping and limiting to have a clean mix. And like, again, like transients, when you think about transients, like they're important, but at the same time, it's like when you're playing on gigantic speakers, huge transients, it's not the end of the world. Like everything sounds big. So just keep that in mind. You can use this clipping method. I've used it now for a little bit, and it's been working for me, so I definitely recommend it. And then another thing you can do that some people do is they start limiting stuff into this. So like you can actually add gain now to like whatever. So maybe this stuff we want to add some like gain to it. So let me make a separate group now for this stuff. We'll call it like vocal. And let me grab this down. Put this in here. So one of the things you can do is actually like push some gain. Actually, this is probably the part. You can limit and use and push gain into certain parts if you want them to be like louder. So if I wanted like these background elements, like these vocal parts and stuff to be louder, I could increase the gain and then just like use the clipping method that I was saying before to still keep it within like reason. Within like it won't blow out, because if you notice, like when I added those elements, it didn't really add that much. So that's maybe a sign that they could be louder or not. It's up to you. You're the one mixing it, so do your thing. All right, cool. So we got a lot of cool stuff going on here, but it wouldn't be a dance track without like some cool side chaining. So let's do some side chaining. What do we want to side chain? That's the first thing we need to think about. And I think the best thing would be like this analog bass. Definitely this analog flow thing. And all the vocals. So we're going to create a group inside a group inside a group. Very confusing, I know. We're going to call it Sidechain. So I know I've been like giving you guys the sauce on all these free plugins. This one unfortunately isn't free, but I think it's like $12. It's not a lot, but this is what I would use. This is what I would recommend using. You go into sidechain mode. You select your input here. You want to go kick snare. And then it's up to you if you want both your kick and your snare. If you just want the kick, you can just go kick post mixer. But if you want both, we'll just do both for now. And let's check it out. I actually don't like this analog bass going through there. I'm going to keep the sub and the analog bass out of the sidechain. So yeah, and then you just drag this, and you can also check in your master like what it's looking like. So it's kind of bow tying a little bit. So you notice how, here, I'll freeze this in a second. So you notice how there's like this, it kind of goes down. So it kind of looks like a bow tie in a way. So that's a sign that I'm like sidechaining a little too hard. Maybe I need to come in a little bit. Let's check it back. Unfreeze. Okay, so that looks much better. I think a lot of this information is just the bass that I'm playing too. It kind of looks like a bow tie. But I can see because of like this part right here, and this part right here, and this part. Like this is what you want. You want your kick to slam in there, and then yeah. This is just because of the bass that we're doing. But like if you can look right here how it's different. That's the vocal too. So yeah, you can see there. But anyway, so that's the way to do it with the paid version. It's $12. And then if you don't want to do that, you can obviously do it the old-fashioned way by using the compressor. And you just hit this little arrow right here. Click that. Click sidechain. Same deal. Kick snare. And then it's depending on what you want to look at. I think I'm going to do this one. And you can change the release. To auto release. Make it easy. But you notice how the kick really comes out, and then you can see that in the master. This is like super exaggerated. But same effect. You get that kind of like pumping effect. And that's like the whole point, is the pumping, kind of pumping effect. Turn it down a little bit. So you want to get about like 6 to 7 dB maybe of gain reduction if you're trying to get this sidechain thing. That's usually what works for me. Or I use this thing, and this thing, it's just a ducker, so it doesn't really, volume doesn't really come that much in effect. It does it automatically. Yeah. So let's erase this. We'll use this one. This one actually kind of sounds better for this track, I think. So that's the thing. Like I said, there's many ways to do things, and certain tracks like call for different things. So it's good to learn all of them. Yeah, so that's sidechaining and ducking. All right, so that was how you sidechain like your whole track, or well, the selected tracks. I'm gonna make this pink. So I'm just sidechaining the vocal, the robot,
the analog background. But like if I had like a synth in here, maybe I would probably sidechain. Like a pad would be really cool to sidechain. But yeah, no, there's a ton of stuff you can do with it. And then it's not even just limited to just doing it on the track. Like you can do it on like separate things. So for instance, say I have a track where there's like a delay. I do this all the time for rappers. Like I'll have a delay on a track but you don't want the delay going while the person's rapping. So all you would do is do the same thing. You just stick the compressor on the track. So say like this is the delay track. Stick the compressor on it, open up the sidechain, and then you do the sidechain with the vocals. So now when the vocals are talking, the compressor is active. And it's like going to be, clamping down, turning your delay down, like, 8 dB, 7 dB, whatever. And then when your vocal stops, it releases, and then you'll hear the delay. So that's a really fun trick to do. And then you can also do like the same thing with like reverb. You can have like a crazy reverb happen when the vocal isn't going on, and then when the vocal starts, you can have the reverb lower. So there's so many different things you can do with saturation, or not saturation, sidechaining. It's really fun. There's a lot you can do with it. So like feel free to experiment. Putting it on the track like I did, that's like the most basic form. Then you can, do it on the delay, do it on the reverb, and then maybe even invent your own way to do it. But yeah, that's another thing you can do with sidechaining. All right, guys, so that's week 3. We went over like tons of mixing concepts, but we stuck to the fundamentals. We didn't get too abstract. We didn't get too fancy. There's a lot more we're going to get into as the weeks go on with mixing that are going to be a little bit more out there and more like with effects and different sounds and stuff. But for now, those are the fundamentals. Using your fader, using your panning, and then, at the end, some delay, some reverb, making kind of space in your mix, making your cuts. Again, like you want a crispy mix, like cut that mud out. You don't need it. If you don't need it, get rid of it. Some instruments you'll need it, and when you need it, you'll know because you'll cut it out and you'll be like, man, that thing sounds weak now. So just go by your ear. Work on your cuts. This week's assignment is going to be, I want you to mix just like I did everything you have been working on so far, and I just want you to mix it up. Maybe do some side chaining if you want. I would like to see that, actually. Yeah, so I want to see some side chaining. I want to see some side chaining. I want to see some groups. Definitely use your sends. I want to see some reverb somewhere. I want to, just do like how I did. Like you guys just watch me work on this mix, and then clean it up at the end too. Like if you notice, like, okay, this vocal's really loud, or this bass is clashing with this, make those cuts now. This is the time to do it. Is in the mixing stage. You don't want to save that for mastering. You want your mix to be perfect. So like let's make your cuts, do your EQ, do your compression if you need to, but start with just the faders and the panning, and then go from there. But yeah, so that's week 3. I'll see you guys next week.